The tunnel was still moving. Not collapsing, that had already finished. Now it was settling, the way dead things settle when they finally decide to accept the weight above them. Sithrak Vorales pressed himself flat against the remaining wall and counted his own heartbeats, waiting for the next groan of shifting rock. The dust was so thick he could not see his hand in front of his face. His crest was dark. He had not noticed when the bioluminescence went out sometime between the first detonation and the second impact. The light had simply stopped, and there was no warmth left to spare for display. He was not afraid. He told himself this in the same tone he used for everything: flat, measured, correct. Keth cadets were trained to metabolize fear the way other species metabolized adrenaline, convert it to information, use it, discard the remainder. He was afraid. He converted it. He reached for what remained. What remained was a low groan from 3 meters to his left, and the sound of something dragging itself through rubble. Vorales. The voice was Dari's veins. The human's accent on keth syllables was imprecise as always. Sound off if you're mobile. I am mobile. Sithrak rolled to his knees and cut his palm on a shard of conduit casing. Cadet Devari. Silence. Dari's. The human's shortened name came out of his mouth before he had approved it. He had not used the shortened form before. Devari is not responding. I heard a scrape of boots on stone, moving carefully, reading the dark by sound alone. The human had no echolocation. He had no sensory supplement that functioned in zero-light environments, and yet he was moving. Sithrak engaged his secondary visual register, the thermal layer, limited in dense rock environments, but enough to find a heat signature at 2 meters. The human was crouching over what had been Cadet Devari's position. The body of stone where Devari had been standing was now 1.5 meters of compacted rubble with a keth-shape-sized absence in it. He did not need to say it. She's gone, the human said. His voice did not break. He did not allow himself additional words about it. How far back is the breach? The primary tunnel ingress collapsed at approximately 80 meters. The secondary egress, Sithrak, ran the geometry in his head, calculating against the live-fire route they had been assigned, the coordinates of the 2 charges that had detonated, the angle of the secondary roof support. The secondary is uncertain. The exercise charges were not rated for this substrate. The seismic interaction with the natural fissure system. Uncertain how. Partially blocked, possibly open, unknown distance, unknown configuration. We would be moving through approximately 4 kilometers of unmapped secondary tunnel before reaching the surface access near training marker 7. The human processed this. In the thermal register, Sithrak could see the steady rhythm of the human's breathing, slow, controlled, deliberate, not the rapid flutter of a species in shock. Sithrak's own breathing was faster than he wanted it to be. Okay, Vane said, can you move? I told you I was mobile. I mean load-bearing. Sithrak did not understand the question. Then he looked down at his own leg in the thermal register and understood that what he had been interpreting as discomfort from the blast pressure was in fact a fracture. He had been standing on it for 4 minutes without categorizing it correctly. This was not acceptable. I am weight-bearing, he said. You're not. The human was beside him now, close enough that Sithrak could feel the warmth of him without the thermal layer. Left tibia. I can hear the way you're distributing load. You cannot. I can, no argument in it, just a fact the human had already processed and moved past. I've got splinting material in my kit, hold still. 4 hours before the tunnel moved, Sithrak Vorales had been standing at the staging line for exercise verath, and making the same private assessment he had made every morning for the 11 days they had been assigned to joint unit rotation. He was looking at the human. Dari's vein was not a remarkable physical specimen by any metric Sithrak could identify. He stood at 1.79 meters below average for his species. Sithrak had looked this up. He did not carry additional muscle mass beyond what his frame required for functional movement. His equipment was standard-issue Verath Training Authority kit, which meant it fit him approximately wrong in 3 places. The way all standard-issue kit fit humans approximately wrong, because the sizing protocols had been engineered for keth and Drevathi body proportions. The human had not requested adjusted fittings. He wore what he was given and did not mention it. He did not volunteer information about himself. He did not appear to need reassurance from the group. He ate his rations at the same time every morning, ran his equipment checks without being prompted, and slept in exactly the intervals the training schedule specified, as if he had consulted a personal timer and found the schedule acceptable. Sethrak had been told before the joint rotation began that human cadets were unremarkable in every category except endurance, and what the keth training staff described, in their reports, as behavioral irregularity under negative stimulus. He had interpreted this as a polite construction for psychological instability. He had revised this interpretation twice in 11 days without quite arriving at a new one. The exercise briefing from Senior Proctor Verschentel was straightforward. Infiltrate the Keth-Drevathi Joint Tunnel Complex at Marker 2, reach the extraction cache at Marker 7, retrieve the exercise package, and return to staging. The live fire designation meant the automated defense systems in the tunnel complex were active at 15% threshold, enough to require tactical movement, not enough to cause injury. The seismic charges were environmental simulation. They went off on a randomized timer to replicate collapse conditions the complex might experience on a contested world. Standard procedure. The Keth Tunneling Corps had run this exercise 240 times. Cadet Devari had asked about the substrate geology report for the training ground. The geology is certified, Verschentel had said. Devari had not pushed it. Sethrak had noted that the human said nothing at all during the briefing, which he interpreted as either deference or disinterest. He had not yet learned to read the difference in this particular face. They entered the tunnel at 6:40. The complex was older than the training authority's current certification cycle, older than the updated Keth-Drevathi joint doctrine that had built this facility in the first place. The entrance was cut stone lined with modern sensor arrays, which made it look newer than it was in the way that medical equipment in an old body sometimes makes the body look functional rather than aged. The walls past the first 50 meters were raw substrate, the kind of gray-green stone that was native to Verath's volcanic uplift system. The floor was poured composite standard, but the ceiling was not. The ceiling was natural. This was supposed to be part of the challenge. The exercise documentation described it as authentic geological environment controlled. Sethrak had noted the natural ceiling and filed it under environmental complexity, which was the appropriate category for this kind of training objective. He had not filed it under geological risk, because the certification said the geology had been assessed, and he trusted certifications. The human had not touched the walls on the way in. He had looked at them, steadily, in the methodical way he looked at things, and then he had looked at the ceiling for a longer moment than the ceiling seemed to warrant, and then he had looked ahead and walked in. Sethrak, several meters back, had observed this and understood it as confirmation that the human was not a geologist and had nothing useful to add to an assessment of the stone. He would, later, revise this interpretation completely. At 7:20, the first charge detonated 200 meters ahead of their position, on schedule, and a small section of the tertiary wall cracked but held. At 7:41, the second charge detonated at the standard 80-second interval, in the secondary lateral tunnel, and something in the substrate that the geology certification had not accounted for decided it had been patient long enough. Sethrak remembered the sound first. Not the detonation itself. The detonation was loud but bounded, a clean mechanical event. What came after was something older and less organized, the sound of deep stone finding a new equilibrium, a long, sustained crack that seemed to begin very far away and arrive at their position with enormous confidence. Devari had turned toward it. She always turned toward sounds, a keth reflex, the ears orienting before the eyes. The human had moved away from it. Not in retreat. In a single step to the right that placed him against the load-bearing wall, the one that wasn't moving, and then he had turned and looked at Devari, and Sethrak had seen him calculate something very quickly with his face in a way that was not quite an expression. Devari, Vane had said one syllable very flat. She had not heard him. Hold still, the human said again. I am holding still. You're compensating, stop compensating. The splinting was not comfortable. Sethrak held still and let the human work. The human's hands were warm. Sethrak was aware of this in a way he had not been before, aware that warmth was a resource, that everything in this tunnel was a resource now that had not been a resource an hour ago. The pressure equalization kit, Sethrak said. What is its current state? He felt rather than saw the pause in the human's hands. 1 unit functional, Vane said. Mine took a fragment. Sethrak processed this. The tunnel system ran through a pressure gradient. This was standard on Verath, which had natural volcanic uplift systems throughout the secondary tunnel network. The training complex had been built across one of these systems deliberately, because pressure management was a training objective. The exercise kit included individual pressure equalization devices for exactly this reason. A cadet moving through the gradient without equalization would suffer vascular stress, painful, progressive, and at certain depths, cumulative in ways that became irreversible. You will use the functional unit, Sethrak said. I was going to. Your kit was damaged. I know. Then you are aware your equalization capacity is. I know. The human tied off the last binding on the splint and sat back. Sethrak could hear him in the dark, the small sounds of him checking his remaining kit, organizing what was left, methodical, unhurried. I know exactly what it means. I've run the numbers. Then you know that moving through the gradient without. Keth tolerate pressure differential less well than humans, Vane said. At the gradients in this tunnel system, you'd have about 40 minutes before the vascular effects become permanent. I've got significantly more runway. I'll be uncomfortable. You'll be fine. A pause. The math works in our favor. Use the unit. Sethrak had been told, before the rotation, that humans were unremarkable in every category except endurance. He had not understood until now that endurance was not a passive quality. He had thought it meant the ability to continue past the point where other species stopped. He had thought of it as a buffer, a larger reserve of the same fuel. What he was looking at was not that. The human was not drawing from a larger reserve. He was drawing from a different account entirely. He had looked at the situation, run the numbers, determined what the situation required, and was now providing exactly that, no more and no less, with the efficiency of a system that had already decided it was not going to allocate resources to distress. The distinction mattered. Sethrak was not sure yet why it mattered in the specific way it did, but he filed it precisely, because he was going to need to think about it later. Ready, he said. Then let's move. Before Sethrak could think about what came next, there was a second hour to survive. The tunnel narrowed gradually as they descended toward what the dead reckoning system indicated was the lowest point of the route. Narrowed was the technically correct word. What it felt like was something else. The walls had a quality that the broader sections did not, a kind of attentiveness, as if the stone was aware of the two figures moving through it and was making a calculation of its own. Sethrak was not given to metaphor. He noted this sensation, classified it as a perceptual artifact of stress and low oxygen and the mild vascular effects of the pressure gradient, and dismissed it. The human was humming, not a melody, a single sustained low note at the edge of audibility, the kind of sound a person makes when they are thinking through something complicated and their body is handling something else. Seathrek had heard this from Vane before on the range when he was zeroing a weapon, and his hands were occupied but his mind was elsewhere. He had not previously assigned meaning to it. "You are aware you are making a sound," Seathrek said. "Yes. It serves a purpose. The resonance from the rock changes at stress points. I'm mapping them." Seathrek processed this. "You are using acoustic resonance to assess the tunnel structure." "I'm using the sound my own voice makes to notice where the sound behaves differently. It's not precise, but it's something." "You do not have the sensory apparatus for." "I know what I don't have," the humming resumed briefly. "I also know what I do have. Keep moving." Seathrak kept moving. He had been told, before the rotation began, that humans were unremarkable in every category except endurance, and what the keth training staff described, in their reports, as behavioral irregularity under negative stimulus. He had been told this by Senior Proctor Verschantel during the pre-rotation briefing, in a tone that suggested the assessment was comprehensive and not subject to revision. He was beginning to suspect that what Verschantel had meant by behavioral irregularity was that humans behaved in ways that keth assessment frameworks did not have categories for. Seathrek had believed, in the first days of the joint rotation, that Darius Vane was simply unmotivated. He had revised this once when the human completed the third-day endurance circuit in a time that placed him in the upper quartile of the entire joint cohort. He had revised it again on day 7, when the human demonstrated that his apparently casual approach to weapons qualification was covering accuracy scores that Seathrak, who was meticulous about weapons qualification, could not match. He had not yet revised his fundamental assessment, which was that the human was somewhat less than the keth cadets surrounding him. Not inferior, precisely. The keth training staff did not use that term, and Seathrak was careful with his language, but operating in a lower register. Less crisp, less precise. The human moved differently than keth cadets moved, with a kind of settled heaviness, as if he had decided in advance that the ground was reliable and was not checking this belief on every step. Keth cadets moved with awareness, with the constant low-level readiness that a species raised on variable terrain maintained as a background process. The human, Seathrak had concluded, was not as alert as a well-trained keth cadet. He had been wrong about this in a specific and interesting way that he would not fully understand for another 4 hours. The error was not in the individual observations. Those had been accurate. The error was in the inference Seathrak had drawn from them, that the human's settled, unhurried manner indicated a lower level of underlying attention. What he had been watching, without understanding it, was a different relationship to attention itself. The human was not less aware than the keth cadets. He was aware differently. He was not constantly checking the ground because he had already made a determination about the ground, and having made it, he saw no reason to repeat the check on every step. He was not monitoring his own performance against the performance of the cadets around him, because he was not competing, not in the sense that the keth cadets understood competition, which was calibration, the continuous comparison of one's own metrics against the available field. He was doing his job. The job was specific and concrete, and the job was the job, and everything else was noise. Seathrak had been trained to attend to everything. The keth cadet doctrine held that situational awareness was the foundation of competence, and situational awareness meant continuous monitoring of the full field: yourself, your unit, your environment, your adversaries, and the gaps between all of these. He was good at this. It cost him something, in the way that continuous monitoring always costs something: a background draw on the processing budget, a low hum of attention that never fully released. He had thought of this cost as the price of competence, and had paid it without examining it. He was, for the first time, examining it. On day 4, there had been a scramble drill in the pre-dawn dark, and the human had come out of his rack and into full kit in a time that Sethrak, who had come out of his rack faster, then spent 40 seconds calibrating his crest light because the dark had startled it into defensive display, would not have been able to match. On day 8, there had been a contact drill where a training drone had dropped from a gantry, and the human had stepped to the side in a movement that should not have been possible without the echolocation keth cadets used to track fast-moving objects in their peripheral field, and the human did not have echolocation. Sethrak had mentioned this to Cadet Devari that evening. "He hears differently," she had said, which was not an explanation. "What does that mean?" I asked him. He said something about frequency ranges. She had tilted her head the way she did when filing information for later use. He said humans can't hear what we hear, so they learn to pay attention to what they can hear, and the rest is pattern recognition. Pattern recognition from incomplete data. Yes. Sethrak had considered this. That is a significant disadvantage. He didn't describe it as a disadvantage, Devari had said, and returned to her kit maintenance. On day 9, there had been an environmental simulation where the training ground's atmosphere processors had been partially disabled to replicate a compromised station environment. The oxygen partial pressure had dropped to 63% of standard, which was below comfortable for keth cadets, and below functional for Dravathi, who had the narrowest atmospheric tolerance of the 3 species in their unit. There had been a recirculator unit in the staging area that could restore partial pressure to a workable level, but the recirculator required calibration, and it was calibrated for keth atmospheric standards, and the calibration protocol was in keth technical notation. Vane had calibrated it in 8 minutes. Sethrak had asked him afterward how he knew the notation. The human had shrugged, a very human gesture, a slight elevation and depression of the shoulders that Sethrak had spent 3 days learning to interpret as "I don't have a better answer for you. It's close enough to standard engineering notation," he had said. "I recognize the structure." "You read keth technical documentation from structural familiarity." "I read enough of it to calibrate a recirculator, yes." This had not been in the human's file. Sethrak had reviewed the human's file, as he reviewed all files for unit members, because understanding a unit's capabilities was a keth officer competency that was assessed and graded. The file had noted the endurance scores, the weapons qualification, the standard cadet credentials from the human academies. It had not noted that the human could read keth technical notation from structural recognition, because no one had asked, and the human had not volunteered it, because the human did not volunteer information about himself as a general practice. Sethrak had mentioned this to Devari that evening. "He probably doesn't think of it as notable," Devari had said. "That is not an explanation." "It might be." He had thought about that briefly and set it aside, as he set many things aside that he could not immediately categorize. He was a good categorizer. The things he set aside were always things that did not fit, and the things that did not fit were usually things he had not yet built the right category for. Now, in the tunnel, with Devari's absence a solid weight in his chest, and the human's hands steady and warm and efficient in the dark, he retrieved it and looked at it again. They moved for the first hour without speaking except for necessity. Vane went first. This was practical. The human was navigating by a combination of the exercise's embedded waypoint transponders, his own wrist unit's dead reckoning system, and what Sethrak eventually concluded was an almost tactile relationship with the tunnel walls, dragging his fingertips along the surface in a way that was reading the structure the way a keth would read an echolocation return. Sethrak followed, maintaining a grip on the human's pack frame at intervals when the tunnel required them to move in close sequence through narrowed sections. His leg was not comfortable. He was not dwelling on this. The first 100 meters were the worst. The dust from the collapse was still thick enough in some sections to reduce visibility even in the thermal register, and the debris field from the ceiling failure was uneven, some areas passable with moderate care, one short section that required them to move on hands and one knee. This was slow. Slow was undesirable. The equalization unit had a battery life of 6 hours under normal conditions, and conditions were not normal, which meant the practical window was shorter, which meant the crossing had to be completed before the question of battery life became relevant. Cethrak calculated this in his head and did not share the calculation, because the human had not asked, and because the calculation's output was continue moving, which was what they were doing. On the other side of the debris field, the tunnel opened slightly, not much, but enough to walk upright, and the floor was clear enough to move at a reasonable pace. Vane increased his speed by a small but consistent increment. Cethrak matched it without comment. His leg hurt. He did not dwell on this. "There's a drop ahead," the human said. "Maybe 1.5 meters," the floor settled. "You can see this." "I can feel it. The airflow changed. There's a gap at floor level, cross-draft. Floor dropped." A pause. "Go down at an angle. Don't put full weight on the landing with the splint." Cethrak had not detected the cross-draft. He filed this, reached the drop, descended at an angle, landed with deliberate weight distribution, continued. The human had already moved 3 meters ahead before Cethrak was fully upright. The pressure gradient began at what Cethrak estimated was 1.2 kilometers in. He felt it in his vascular system first. The keth circulatory mechanism was exquisitely sensitive to pressure change, which was advantageous in most environments and disadvantageous in this one. The equalization unit was working. The pressure was being managed. He monitored his own status with the same attention he gave to everything, and noted that the unit was performing exactly as specified, and noted also that the human was not wearing one, and noted the rate at which the gradient was increasing as they descended toward the lower tunnel sections. "Dariz," he said. "I'm fine. I did not ask." "You were about to." Cethrak conceded this. "Your status." "Elevated discomfort. Managed." A pause. "I can feel it in my ears, in my joints, there's a compression sensation in the chest. It's not acute. I've been briefed on the tolerance parameters for humans at these gradients. I'm inside the window." The tolerance parameters assume a functional equalization unit within 30 minutes of gradient entry. They assume equalization access within 2 hours of gradient entry for species in the human physiological band. I've got time. The window narrows significantly if there is physical exertion. I know. You are currently engaged in significant physical exertion. I know that too. The human's voice was entirely even. "Voralis, I've run these numbers. You're not telling me anything I haven't already processed. What I need from you right now is to keep moving and let me know if your fracture is affecting your weight distribution in a way I should adjust for." Cethrak moved and did not speak for another 200 meters. "Then why?" "Why what? Why did you not simply tell me that you had one functional equalization unit, that it was more efficient for you to carry it?" "Because you would have argued." "I am arguing now." "You're asking questions, that's different." Vane's fingers found a section of collapsed ceiling, probed it, found a path around the left side. An argument is when you're trying to change the outcome. Questions are when you're trying to understand it. Cethrak filed this. The human was making a distinction between argument and inquiry in a way that implied the human had already decided the outcome was correct and was only explaining the reasoning to prevent conflict. He had not been asked. He had simply calculated the math and acted on it, and was now providing the explanation in a way that was generous rather than dismissive. He had met cadets who were generous. He had not previously thought of generosity as a tactical asset. The second hour brought the first real obstacle. The tunnel system had a branch point at what the exercise maps labeled as Junction 7 Bravo, and Junction 7 Bravo, per the wrist unit's dead reckoning, was ahead of them. But the tunnel had settled since the maps were made, and when they reached the branch point, the left passage was open and the right passage was narrowed to approximately 60 centimeters. The direct route to Marker 7 was the right passage. Cethrak looked at the 60 centimeters and measured himself against it. He was 1.94 meters of keth cadet, currently in full exercise kit with a splinted leg. He might fit. The word might was doing significant work in that sentence. I can remove the kit and push it through separately, he said. How long does that take you? He calculated 8 to 10 minutes. The pressure is still building. Vane was already unclipping his own pack from his shoulders. I'll go through first and pull from the other side. That'll cut the time. You are proposing to move through a 60-centimeter passage with your kit. Without my kit, pack goes through after. He looked at the passage with his head slightly tilted in the way Cethrak had learned to associate with him calculating something. I've been in tighter. This is not a reassurance. Wasn't meant to be. He set his pack down, checked the wrist unit, checked the passage again. When I'm through, I'll call back. Follow immediately, don't wait. He went through in 90 seconds. It should have taken longer. Cethrak, watching the thermal trace in his secondary register, observed the human compress himself in a way that seemed improbable and did not, at any point, involve force or panic. Only a kind of systematic reduction, placing each limb sequentially into the least occupied position available, moving in segments the way water moves. Through, Vane called from the other side. Cethrak spent 7 minutes and 40 seconds getting his kit free, passing it through, and getting himself through the passage. And during those 7 minutes and 40 seconds, the pressure equalization unit was doing its work, and he was aware, clearly and precisely, that it was doing work for him that the human was managing without it. When he emerged on the other side, the human had his pack reassembled and was ready to move. 2 kilometers, Vane said, maybe a little more. Your status? Managing. Cethrak looked at him in the thermal register and saw that the human's core temperature had dropped slightly, which was a stress response, and that his respiration had increased, which was also a stress response, and that his posture had not changed at all, which was something else. You are not managing as well as you are reporting, Cethrak said. The human turned toward him in the dark. His face was invisible, his voice was even. No, he said, I'm not, but I'm inside the threshold. Keep moving. They moved. The tunnel system past Junction 7 Bravo was different in character from the sections before it, older, less regular, the kind of geology that had not been modified by the training authority because it had not needed to be. The survey on record said it was stable. Cethrak was aware, with a clarity he had not felt about survey documentation before today, that the geological survey on record for the sections behind them had also been certified. He monitored his equalization unit. It was performing within specification. He monitored the human. The fragment wound, he said. A pause, it's minor. I observed it on the thermal register. You are bleeding. Slowly, the human's voice was still even. Wound closure is manageable at this rate. It's not going to kill me in the next 2 kilometers. That is a remarkably specific assurance. It's accurate, a brief silence. I know what my body is telling me right now. I can read the difference between something that needs addressing immediately and something that needs addressing soon. This needs addressing soon. When is soon? When we're on the surface, and the medical team has had a look at you. Cethrak had nothing to say to this. He filed the fragment wound alongside the pressure differential, alongside the splinted leg, alongside the absent third member of their unit, and he walked. The tunnel had a sound. All tunnels had sounds, but this one was specific, a low, continuous note at the threshold of hearing, the kind of sound that stone makes when it is under sustained load and considering its options. Cthrak had been trained to identify this sound. It was not the sound of imminent collapse. It was the sound of a structure that had been through something significant and was deciding slowly whether it intended to hold. He decided that the tunnel intended to hold. He decided this with the information available, knowing it was a decision rather than a certainty, and then he behaved as though it were a certainty because the alternative was not useful. He was aware, moving through the dark, that this was different from how he would have reasoned 12 hours ago. 12 hours ago, he would have calculated probability distributions. He would have wanted a number. He would not have been satisfied with a decision in the absence of a number. He passed another section of roof that had cracked along its length, a new crack, fresh, the stone still showing clean gray-white at the break. He marked it, noted the direction of stress it implied, and kept walking. The human, a meter ahead, had passed the same section without altering his pace. Cthrak could not tell if the human had noticed it. He suspected the human had noticed it, had made his own assessment, had filed it under continuing to walk, and had continued walking. They were similar in this specific moment, in a way that Cthrak had not expected to find. Not because they were using the same information or the same process. Because they had arrived at the same place by different roads. Move, because moving was the right answer, and the quality of the certainty you felt about moving was not the most important variable in whether you moved. The human ahead of him had never appeared to want a number. He had wanted to know if the math worked. The math had worked, or had worked well enough, and he had moved. He did not appear to require the additional confirmation that the number would have provided, and Cthrak, walking in the dark with an equalization unit doing its quiet work and a splinted leg that was beginning to register discomfort beyond the merely inconvenient, was starting to understand that this was not because the human was incurious. It was because the human had made a different calculation about what information was actionable. There was a moment, somewhere in the second kilometer of the return, when Cthrak understood what he was watching. He had been, in his private assessment, generous to the human. He had observed over 11 days that Dari's vein was competent, that he was accurate, that he was steady in ways that were not always visible until they mattered. He had revised his initial assessment of unremarkable to something closer to quietly capable. He had thought of this as a reasonable and fair evaluation. He had not thought of what he was watching as a choice. He was watching it now. The human was walking through a 4-kilometer unmapped tunnel system with a deteriorating pressure differential, a kit fragment wound in his side that Cthrak had noticed 200 meters back, when the thermal register caught the heat signature of the injury through the suit fabric, and a fracture in his right hand that Cthrak had not noticed until he saw the way the human held his wrist unit. He had not mentioned either of these. He was moving at a pace that Cthrak, with a functioning equalization unit and a splinted leg and no additional injuries, was working to maintain. He was doing this because the math had worked out in Cthrak's favor, and he had done the math, and that was the end of it. Cthrak had trained for 3 years to manage fear. He had converted many fears into information and discarded the remainder. He was very good at this, and it was useful, and he had thought of it as a form of discipline that set a standard for what a well-trained cadet should be able to do. He was coming to understand, nearly as good at it as the human walking ahead of him. The human was not managing fear the way Cthrak managed it, by acknowledging it as a thing to be metabolized and discarding the remainder. The human was doing something different. He was simply not making fear the governing variable. The fear was present. Cthrak could see the physiological signs of it in the thermal register, the stress responses, the cost the body was paying. But the calculation did not include it in the output. The fear was input, acknowledged, and then the calculation produced a result that had nothing to do with what the fear wanted. The thermal register showed the human's heat signature dipping slightly at irregular intervals, a systemic response to the pressure differential that the body could not fully suppress. The fragment wound was still seeping. The hand fracture was invisible in the thermal view but present in the way the human held the wrist unit, cradling it slightly against the forearm rather than gripping it with the full hand. 3 injuries, none mentioned. The pace unchanged. "Dariz," he said. "Don't." "I was not." "You were going to say something about the unit. The math is correct. Don't revisit it." Cthrak was not going to say something about the unit. He had accepted the math. He had been going to say something else. He found, briefly, that he did not have the vocabulary for it, and that this was frustrating in a way that was new, because he usually had vocabulary. "I am glad," he said, "that you were assigned to this unit." A long pause. The human's footsteps continued, steady, unhurried. "I know," Vane said. "Keep moving." They reached the access shaft at marker 7 at hour 3, 16 minutes. The shaft was open. 12 meters of vertical ladder, military standard spacing, leading to a surface hatch that Cthrak could see as a faint gray rectangle at the top. Not daylight. The training ground was under an overcast, but lighter than the tunnel, light enough to be visible. He looked at the human. The human was standing with one hand on the ladder, his head down slightly, breathing in a controlled way that Cthrak recognized as the kind of breathing a body does when it is telling itself that the next step is manageable, and the one after that is manageable, and it does not need to think farther than that. "You should go first," Cthrak said. "The climb will be faster for you. You can signal for extraction." Vane shook his head, a small movement. "You go first, I'll be right behind you." "You are concerned that if I go ahead you will not." "You go first, I'll be right behind you." There was something in the human's voice that was not quite an order and not quite a request. It was a thing said with certainty about a fact that had not yet occurred, and Cthrak understood with a clarity that surprised him that the human was not going to stop until Cthrak was through the hatch, that this was simply how the human had decided it would go. He climbed. The ladder was standard military issue, and his splinted leg made the climb slower than he wanted, and he did not look down because he did not need to hear the human breathing below him to know that the human was there. He went up 12 meters and hit the hatch release and pushed through into gray verath morning air, cold and thin and clean, and immediately activated his distress beacon and turned back to the hatch. Vane came through 45 seconds later. He sat down on the rock beside the hatch and did not stand up again. Cthrak crouched beside him and ran the assessment he had been running in his head for the last 40 minutes against the visible reality. Fragment wound, hand fracture, pressure differential exposure, 3 hours and 16 minutes of sustained physical work in a hostile environment without equalization support. He had a list. The list was not comfortable. "The beacon is transmitting," he said. "Response time for this training ground is 8 to 14 minutes. Vane nodded. He was breathing carefully, the way a person breathes when they are deciding, on each breath, how much effort it should cost and what they can get for that cost. "You should lie down," Cthrak said. "I'm fine sitting." "You are not." "I know." A pause. "I'll lie down when the team gets here. Right now I want to know how far down the shaft is from where we're sitting." 12 meters. "And you came up on a fractured tibia." "Yes." "Okay." The human looked out at the training ground. The sky over Verath was a flat overcast, the kind that held light without offering any of it everything the same color, the rock and the sky and the middle distance indistinguishable from each other except by texture. There was a wind. It was cold. The human did not appear to notice the cold, which Cthrak thought was probably a stress response, and then revised. The human might simply not mind it. He had realized over the past 3 hours that the categories of probably stress response and simply doesn't mind were not as distinguishable as he had believed. Devari, the human said. He did not add anything to this. Yes, Sethrak said. They sat with that for a moment. There was not much to say. There was an entire conversation available about what had happened and what had not happened and what Devari had done when she turned toward the sound. And none of it was a conversation that served any purpose right now, in the cold gray light on the surface of a training ground where a mountain was still deciding what it had become. Sethrak noted that the human did not push toward that conversation, and noted that this was a mercy, and noted that the human probably did not think of it as mercy. It was probably simply the same calculation the human applied to everything. What information is actionable and what is not, and what should you do with the difference? Your hand, Sethrak said. I know about my hand. The fracture is significant. I know, a very brief pause. The hand hurt less once I stopped thinking about it. That is not a medically coherent statement. No, it's an accurate one. He looked at his wrist, at the angle that the hand made when it was resting against his knee, an angle that was slightly wrong in a way that would have been immediately obvious to a keth medical examiner, but that the human apparently filed somewhere below his operational awareness and left there. When the hand stopped being something I could fix, it stopped being something that needed my attention. I still felt it. I just didn't process it the same way. You redirected your processing allocation. I suppose that's one way to say it. Sethrak thought about this. He thought about the fear he had metabolized in the tunnel, the fear he had converted to information and discarded. He thought about what it would mean to do something different, not to metabolize the fear and discard it, but to simply remove it from the active processing queue and let it sit somewhere else while the hand did its work or the math got run or the tunnel got navigated. He thought about whether that was the same thing or something adjacent to the same thing, and he thought about how the human had never appeared to be fighting anything. He had appeared to be working. The fear and the pain and the pressure differential were things the work happened alongside, not things the work was in opposition to. The beacon pulsed on his wrist. Medical response inbound, ETA 9 minutes. Vorali's vein said. Yes. You did well in there. Sethrak looked at him. The human was still looking at the middle distance, at the flat gray sky and the flat gray rock of the training ground, at nothing in particular. His face was not quite an expression, as always, but there was something in the line of it that Sethrak had not seen before, not warmth, exactly, or not only warmth. Something older than warmth. Something that looked like the way a person's face looks when they are telling a fact they are not certain will be received. I was functional, Sethrak said. Yes, a pause, that's what I said. The medical team arrived in 11 minutes. This was a good response time for a training ground where the official designation was still exercise scenario in progress. The exercise designation was updated to training casualty at 9:34, which was when the initial reports from the tunnel ingress camera system established that the seismic interaction had not been, in fact, within the exercise parameters that had been certified. The geology certification was subsequently reviewed, and the review found 3 things that the original assessment had missed. Cadet Devari's recovery operation was a separate matter with a separate timeline. Sethrak spent 2 hours in the medical bay and was assessed as having a clean fracture of the left tibia, equalization facilitated management of the pressure gradient transit, and no significant additional injuries. He was told he would be on restricted movement for 12 days. Dari's vein spent significantly longer in the medical bay. The pressure differential damage was within reversible parameters. This was, the medical staff indicated, somewhat surprising given the transit distance and gradient depth and the absence of equalization support. The fragment wound was minor. The hand fracture, which he had not mentioned at any point in the 3-hour transit, was significant enough to require fixation. He was assessed as having done considerable physical work on a broken hand, without flagging it, or modifying his performance in any way that would have drawn attention to it. The lead medic, a keth female of mid-career rank named Sorvath Kaz, reviewed the assessment and made a notation in the file that Cthrak was later given access to, because he asked. The notation read, in the clipped terse phrasing of keth medical documentation, human cadet presented with 3 discrete unreported injuries sustained during transit, all managed without measurable behavioral change. Recommend cross-species physiological briefing for unit cohort on human injury reporting norms, as current presentation is not consistent with injury concealment behavior and appears to represent baseline operational standard for this individual. Cthrak read this twice. He then went to the section of the medical bay where Vane was being assessed and stood in the doorway, and the human looked up at him from the examination table with the same face he always had, no particular expression, no particular display, and Cthrak said the thing he had not been able to say in the tunnel. "I have written my incident report," he said. "I intend to file a supplemental assessment of the equalization decision, if you object to this." "I don't," Vane said. "It will be on record." "I know," a pause, "it won't change anything." "No," Cthrak said, "it will not. That is not why I am filing it." The human looked at him for a moment. His expression was still not quite an expression. "Okay," he said, "then file it." The supplemental assessment was logged into the Verath Training Authority's incident database on the same day, and it was neither unusual nor remarkable in any administrative sense. Supplemental assessments after training casualties were standard procedure, and this one followed the standard format. What it contained, inside the standard format, was a technical account of a pressure gradient transit in an unmapped tunnel system that was accurate in every detail, and that, if read carefully, made several things very clear. The first clear thing was that the equalization decision had been made before the transit began, quickly and without consultation, on the basis of a calculation that the human had done in his head in approximately 60 seconds. The second clear thing was that the human had then spent 3 hours not mentioning this decision, not revisiting it, and not modifying his output to account for the physical cost it was imposing. The third clear thing, which Cthrak had considered for the entire 11-minute wait on the surface before the medical team arrived, watching the human sit on the rock with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, was harder to render in standard assessment format. He had tried several versions of the sentence and discarded them until he found one that was accurate without requiring the reader to understand something they would have to experience to fully know. He had tried, subject demonstrated exceptional commitment to unit welfare. This was accurate but insufficient. Commitment implied emotional investment, and emotional investment implied that the investment might have been withheld. The human had not chosen to invest himself. He had looked at the situation and seen what it required and provided it. The choice had been made before the crisis began, at the level of who the human was and how he was organized, not at the level of any single decision during the transit. He had tried, subject showed willingness to accept personal risk. This was also accurate but wrong in the same way. Willingness implied reluctance overcome. There had been no reluctance to overcome. There had been a calculation. The calculation had produced a result. The result was executed. He had tried variations on both of these for the entire 11 minutes, and all of them had the same error, which was that they described the human's actions as the product of something the human had done to himself, a decision made, a cost accepted, a commitment honored, when what he had actually observed was something that did not fit into those categories at all. The human had not forced himself to do the math. He had simply done it. He had not forced himself to accept the result. He had simply accepted it. The space between knowing what was required and doing it, which for Cthrak was a space that had to be crossed and sometimes cost something to cross, appeared in the human to be a distance of approximately 0. He wrote, subject made a single resource allocation decision under crisis conditions, executed it without deviation, and maintained full operational output for the duration of the transit. No additional instruction, oversight, or encouragement was required or requested. He thought about this for a moment, and then he added one more line, which was not standard assessment format and which he did not remove. He wrote, "I have been training for 3 years to perform as this individual performed today. I do not believe the 3 years are the relevant variable." The training authority's database cataloged this as an incident report and assigned it a file number and moved it into the standard processing queue. Cthrak was given 12 days of restricted movement. Vane was given 9 days of recovery leave, which he used entirely to requalify his hand on the weapon's range, beginning on day 4, 6 days before the medical authorization. No one told him to do this, no one needed to. There was a review board for the exercise verath incident. Cthrak attended, as the senior surviving cadet of the unit. He gave his account in the precise way he gave all accounts: sequential, factual, without editorial. And when the review board asked him whether the training exercise had, in his assessment, been safely designed and properly supervised, he said yes to the design question and was silent for 3 seconds before answering the supervision question. Senior Proctor Verschentel was present at the review. He did not look at Cthrak during the silent 3 seconds. Cthrak answered the supervision question honestly, which was the only way he knew to answer questions. He said that the supervision had been within the established standards for this class of exercise, and that the established standards did not account for the seismic interaction that had occurred, and that this was a finding the review board might wish to note. The review board noted it. Verschentel said nothing. There was also a question about the equalization unit decision. A board member, a Dravathi senior officer whose name Cthrak did not catch, had read the supplemental assessment and wanted to understand the reasoning. She said, "The assessment indicates the human cadet made an unilateral resource allocation that placed him at significant physiological risk. The board would like to understand whether you consider this decision to have been within appropriate unit protocols." Cthrak had considered the question for 4 seconds. He was precise about the 4 seconds because he had been aware, while he was considering, that he was considering, and he had been aware that 4 seconds was a long time for a keth cadet to consider a straightforward question. "The decision was correct," he said. "The math was sound. I would have taken significantly more time to arrive at the same conclusion. In the time I would have taken, we would likely have been unable to complete the transit within the equalization window. The decision was not a protocol violation. It was a better solution than the protocols anticipated." The Dravathi officer had looked at him for a moment. "You are aware that better than the protocols anticipated is not the same as within appropriate unit protocols." "Yes," Cthrak said. "I am aware of the distinction. I answered a different question." No one on the board had anything to add to this. After the review, walking back through the corridors of the Verath training complex toward the restricted movement ward where he had been assigned a bunk for the duration of his recovery, Cthrak passed the weapon's range. He could hear it before he saw it, the flat report of a training weapon, steady and evenly spaced, with the small pause between groups that indicated a cadet reloading from a fresh magazine rather than from a ready supply, because a fresh magazine required the injured hand to close around the release, and closing the injured hand around anything required a deliberate decision that a cadet with a newly fixed fracture was making repeatedly, on a 9-second cycle. 6 days before the medical authorization had said he could. He did not look into the range. He did not need to. He walked back to his bunk and sat on the edge of it and thought about the supplemental assessment he had filed, and thought about the 3 years he had spent training, and thought about the thing he had written. "I do not believe the 3 years are the relevant variable." He had meant it as an observation about the human. He was beginning to understand that it was also an observation about himself. The 3 years were not nothing. They had made him competent, accurate, steady in many ways. But the relevant variable, the thing that had been in the tunnel with him, navigating 4 kilometers of unmapped stone in the dark with a broken hand and no equalization, and a wound he did not mention. That was not something the 3 years had put there. The 3 years could teach tactics, they could teach precision, they could teach the conversion of fear into information. They could not teach the thing that made a person do the math, accept the result, and not revisit it. He was not sure that was a teachable thing. He was not sure it needed to be. Some things you encountered and recognized and let reshape your understanding of what was possible without requiring that you be able to replicate them. He was a keth cadet. He was meticulous and accurate and good at his work. He was going to be good at his work for the rest of his career, and the work was going to benefit from today and from the shape of what he now understood. That was enough. He did not tell Verath Sen what he was thinking about. He was thinking about a specific thing that Vane had said in the tunnel in the second hour, when Sethrek had asked why he had not simply told Sethrek about the equalization unit from the beginning. An argument is when you're trying to change the outcome. Questions are when you're trying to understand it. He was beginning to understand that this was not a distinction the human had developed for the tunnel. It was a distinction the human carried with him all the time, in the same way he carried his kit maintenance schedule and his ration timing, as a settled fact about how the world worked that he had checked once and found acceptable and was not going to check again. The human did not argue with situations. He assessed them, determined what was required, and provided it. The assessment could change if new information arrived. Sethrek had watched this happen. The slight pause when new information was incorporated, the adjustment in approach that followed. But the human did not argue with the assessment once it was made, did not revisit it hoping the outcome would be different, did not spend processing resources on the version of events in which the outcome was better than it was. He accepted results. He worked with them. This was not resignation. It was the opposite of resignation. It was the refusal to let the gap between what you wanted and what was real consume the energy you needed for what was. Sethrek did not know the word for this in Keth. He was not certain Keth had one. He was going to find out. The mountain on the Verath training ground was still settling. It would settle for weeks, working out what it had become. Sethrek understood in the way he understood things that mattered that something in his own assessment structure was doing the same slowly, taking its time, finding a new equilibrium. He did not rush this. Some things took the time they took, and rushing them produced wrong results. He had a new category to build, and he did not yet have the name for it, and he had decided he would take as long as he needed to get the name right. Outside the medical bay, on the third morning, Vane sat on the stone steps in the thin Verath light and ate his rations at exactly the time the schedule specified, and did not appear to be thinking about anything in particular. Sethrek watched him from the window and thought that this was also part of it somehow. The ordinary things done at their ordinary times, in exactly the ordinary way, as if nothing had changed and everything was still intact. As if the ground was reliable and the human had already decided this was the case and was not going back to check. He did not know the name for this either. He was going to learn it.